precede this talk by saying it's going to be a continuation of Michael's talk. I am amazed at how well we take note of what's going on in the world and bring the news into our talks each day. I will begin with Bible verses, and the first one is from Genesis 18:14. Is anything too hard for God? And from Exodus 14:13, and Moses said unto the people, fear not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. From Psalms 112:7, he shall not be afraid of evil tidings, for his heart is fixed, trusting in the Lord. And from Luke, for with God nothing shall be impossible. We all have times in our lives when we feel very strongly that God is just so far from us, that there is something impossible about this situation, that God cannot or will not or is not going to take care of it. I would suggest to you, thank God anyway, because God can do whatever needs to be done in your life. With God, all things are possible. It's true, and you can prove it. We all meet with problems, and I like to call them projects, which we think are impossible to solve, and they are when we try to solve them alone. Take God with you. Let God help you solve your problem. Not long ago, the Berlin Wall went down. How impossible that seemed to us at the time. Long before it went down, I know all of us were thinking we could never get it down unless we had a shooting war. There were some shots fired, but that didn't matter very much because the people in that country walked across that barrier, through that wall, unhampered. God was working there. Notice that happened as we began to pray for peace. Peace is possible. Was part of that transformational process. I remember telling people in a class that I had in Minneapolis that God could bring that wall down. That somewhere along the line, those prayers going up on the 31st of December would bring peace to this world, could bring peace to this world. Who would have guessed, just prior to that the two superpowers would be sitting down together trying to solve the problems of this world, working together to get the smaller nations. Who would have thought that the little Baltic states could demand their freedom and get it? Who would have thought that the Ukraine could become a sovereign nation? Think of that. Think how important that is. Somewhere along the line, our peace is possible. Our peace is possible prayers worked somehow or other when we got in touch with what our higher consciousness knew was true, that this world is a harmonious place, that this is a friendly universe, that it was demonstrated. Terry Anderson, I was so delighted to hear when they asked him, what was it that kept him going all those years? One of his remarks was, my faith and the prayers of the people in the world. And I heard him say this so emphatically. Prayers were an important part of his process. It was an important part of his survival. It was his faith. He said, it was my faith. Marvelous, wonderful way to put it, because what it does is give validity and power to our prayers. It lets us know that somebody prays even when they're in what might be called an impossible situation. In other words, he was contacting God because he knew God could do it. He knew God could take care of it. He knew, and the people that were praying for him, Think of how faithful his sister was in trying to get him out of this situation. Lest we think that I'm going to talk all about world affairs, no. I'd like to bring my family and a personal experience in this, because I know that God works. And I'll tell you about a little situation that happened when I was a little girl. It established my faith in God beyond belief. And I've never doubted God's care for me. All I doubt is my ability to listen to what he wants to tell me. You know, every now and then, I can't quite hear what he's trying to tell me. Okay, to get back to the little demonstration on our part. And this was a joint demonstration among our family. One November night, when I was a little girl, my father came home and announced to my mother that the money that he was going to give to her to run our house for the next 2 weeks had fallen out of his pocket, and he did not know where it was. Now, he knew that he had it when he got off the bus, so he knew that it had to be somewhere on the block that he walked to get to our house. Well, you can imagine that it caused my mother some little concern, and she was a little upset about this, but then after she began to get her act together, why she told us that, girls, my father now wasn't the most praying individual on earth. I think he was a meditator in a certain sense, but he wasn't a prayer. He didn't turn to prayer like my mother did, bless her heart. And so she said, girls, we'll pray about this. Now, we were tiny little girls. I would suppose I wasn't over 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7. Anyway, the next morning she got up after we had prayed about all of this, and she said to my father, I think you better call the paper and put a want ad in the lost and found section, telling where your money was lost, and you know, just our telephone number, so that if it's been found, they can bring it back or call it. Within 24 hours, my mother and father got a call that money had been found about a block and a half away from our house, among the leaves that the neighbors were raking, and that they wanted to return it to us. Now, this money had absolutely no identification on it, and it was a fall day, and leaves were heavy. When you think of how impossible that situation is, it just befuddles you, boggles your mind. The leaves could have covered the money, because it wasn't very big amount of money. It was the amount of money, but there weren't many bills. Somebody could have picked that up off the street when they were walking down, because it's a pretty long walk, and people take that bus, and they're there. It could have been blown away. It could have been blown away. Or the people that found it in the leaves could have been so impressed with finding the money that they could have felt that this was God's bounty for them. They didn't. They looked in the want ads for 2 days back, because they wanted to be sure they didn't miss that if it was in there. And when they found my mother and our telephone number and the call about it, or the notice about it, they were thrilled. They really wanted to return that money. Of course, my mother and father rewarded them for it, but it was just the idea. Think how impossible. And from that day to this, I know that with God, all things are possible. I'll tell you that Myrtle Fillmore writes about this in her book, Healing Letters. She says, so we rejoice and remember that we have the God power to change conditions, and I would add impossible situations. The God love to express Christ-likeness, and we work lovingly and diligently with whatever we find ourselves in or our environment that falls short, keeping the attention centered in the Christ mind, where you're able to see beyond the appearances to the impulses of the soul, which is always urging us in our efforts to make use of what God has given. In other words, just think if my mother or my father had felt that it was impossible to put that ad in the paper. To the degree that we let the Christ be lifted up, and in the same degree shall we rid ourselves of that which may have been pronounced incurable, and I would add impossible, or may have seemed to us a disease that was incurable, or I would say a situation that was impossible. Let us more and more remember that that which Jesus Christ said, with God, all things are possible. And let us listen until we hear within, is there anything too hard for Jehovah? Nothing is too difficult for God. Prayer and meditation will get you over the hill. Prayer and meditation will allow you to hear God's voice speaking to you. With God, all things are possible. I've proved it, the world proves it, and you can